Welcome back, guys. So this is going to be the first video I make in a series where I analyze my own classical chess games. So these are very long time control games over the board. I have 90 minutes, my opponent has 90 minutes, and we also gain 30 seconds every time we make a move. So these games can last like 4.5 hours. It's kind of crazy. You'll also notice that these games are USCF rated, so they're in person, over the board. The US Chess Federation rates these games, so you'll see our ratings show up as USCF ratings. For comparison, chess.com rapid ratings are about 200 points inflated over USCF ratings. You'll also notice that I'm not going to put my opponent's last name just for anonymity's sake. I don't need to hype up anyone who's just crushed me in a classical game, all right? All right, so let's get into the game. I had the white pieces here, and I wanted to play the London system, so I went d4, knight f6, and here I go bishop f4, playing into the London system. My opponent played e6. Normally, I would play e3 in this kind of position, but I played knight f3 just to stay flexible. Then my opponent played d5. I went with e3, and he also played knight b to d7. So this I thought was a somewhat strange move. Usually in the London system, black tries to play c5 and then knight c6, not knight c6 before c5, because we want this pawn here to undermine white's center. But if you put this knight here on d7, you kind of cramp your own position a little bit, and you'll see later in the game that black does get a little cramped, and I think part of it is because the knight is on d7. So I play bishop d3. My opponent now does play c5. I play c3 to solidify my center. And here my opponent takes. I could have taken with the c-pawn or the e-pawn. I chose to take with the e-pawn just because I wanted to create a little bit of a positional imbalance in this position. So if you take with the c-pawn, that's perfectly fine. There's no issue with that, but the pawn structures are symmetrical, so there aren't as many attacking chances in that kind of position. So I took with the e-pawn for that reason. My opponent played bishop e7, and as you can see here, my opponent's pieces are not super well placed. They're relatively passive. This bishop normally would want to come out to d6, but it can't because this knight blocks the connection between the queen and the d6 square. So the bishop would, of course, be undefended. So the bishop has to go to e7. I brought my other knight out to d2, and here my opponent played b6. Of course, he has to play b6 to develop this bishop because the bishop can't go anywhere else. Here I castle, my opponent castles, and I play queen e2 just to finish my development, bringing my final piece into the game and connecting my rooks. So, the opening is finally completed for me. So now my opponent played a5. a5 doesn't really create any threats. a4, a3, if I gave my opponent two more moves so he could play both of those, that wouldn't really create any problems for me. But I felt very solid in the center, and I felt like I didn't need to allow any kind of counterplay. So I just played a4, just solidifying this b6 pawn as a backwards pawn. And this is going to be a positional weakness for black for the rest of the game. So I went with a4, but there might have been a better move. My opponent played knight h5, attacking my bishop. Of course, I don't want to give my bishop away, so I drop it back to e3. And then my opponent improves the position of his other bishop, and he plays bishop d6. So after bishop d6, I played a move that you have to calculate a little bit. So I played knight e5, and you'll notice that this knight is now attacked by two different pieces, and we were only defending it by a pawn. But to compensate for that, this knight on h5 is hanging, and additionally we have ideas of playing bishop takes h7 check. So this knight on e5 is actually defended tactically. If our opponent were to take it with the knight, we would take back with the pawn. And of course, this bishop cannot take on e5 because here we can just simply take the knight on h5. Separately, our opponent does not want to take the knight on e5 with the bishop because we're going to take back with the pawn, and this pawn on e5 is untouchable. If the knight were to take, we would play bishop takes h7 check, and after the king takes, we'll take the knight on h5 with check, and then we'll take the other knight. If the knight doesn't take on e5, then black has to play something like g6, which just feels like a waste of a tempo and is very visually ugly. So instead, our opponent just played knight h to f6, just brought the knight back. Here I played bishop g5, trying to pin this knight, putting some pressure against the queen, and also just improving the position of this bishop. My opponent unpinned his queen with queen c7, and here I played f4. f4 is an aggressive move, definitely shows my attacking intentions here. It does expose the king a little bit, but I think practically in this position, that's not an issue. And additionally, in the London system with this knight on e5, we frequently like bringing our pawn up to f4 because it solidifies this e5 square. Now if my opponent takes this knight, I can take back with the f5 pawn, which creates this really solid pawn chain. And additionally, it will open up this f-file rook. Maybe we can even lift it, swing it over. So this move creates a lot of attacking potential. So my opponent just played bishop b7, finally developing his last piece. I wasn't entirely sure what to do in this position, so I just played rook a to e1, the kind of move that you can't go wrong with playing, just activating my rook and bringing it towards the center. So here my opponent played rook f to e8. I thought this move was a little strange. I was surprised that he didn't bring his other rook over to the e-file. This rook on a8 isn't doing anything really. It's just staring at a pawn that's not moving at all. And additionally, this rook on f8 is doing something. It's defending this pawn on f7, and we have some ideas of already attacking on the king side if we play like f5 and we take here, or if eventually this knight moves, we can bring this queen over, and then we have pressure on f7. Additionally, we have this rook here on this almost open file. So we have a lot of pressure here, and I think it would have made more sense to bring the other rook over. But nonetheless, he played rook f to e8. Here I played rook f3, just preparing to slide the rook over and again, just create more kingside attacking pressure. So in this position, my opponent played bishop e7, and yeah, you'll start to see the eval bar spike. There is a really, really beautiful attacking idea in this position, so pause the video if you want to try to find it. Hopefully you found it. If you didn't, don't worry about it. The move is knight takes f7. Now, the king cannot take this knight, because if he does so, we will take on e6 with check. The king has to go to f8. And now here is the critical move that you had to find to be able to see knight f7. There's only one move in this position that keeps the advantage for white. So again, pause the video, try to find it. Oh my god, you found it, didn't you? Look at you, you beast. The move is bishop g6, exclamation point. Oh my lord. So we're creating an attacking threat on f7, specifically, it's a checkmate threat. So the only way for our opponent to try to stop that checkmate threat is to play knight e5. But if he plays knight e5, we're just going to take with the f-pawn. Now this knight is pinned. We have this rook aiming at the king. We're just doing way too well, and the opponent's king is totally stuck in the open. So knight e5 is not a great option. The other move to consider is pawn takes g6, but in this position, there is again one very nice idea, and it's simply rook h3. This threat of bringing the rook over is very, very strong. The only way to stop this kind of checkmating threat, to stave it off for a little bit, is to go knight h5. But even here, we go bishop takes e7 with check. The king can't move, so the rook has to take. We take back with the queen, and after king g8, we're going to play just, queen e6 check. The king will move. We'll take this pawn on g6, and this black king is just way, way too exposed. So I actually saw almost all of this. I didn't exactly see the knight h5 line, but I saw almost all of these variations, and so I went for this move. Now, of course, our opponent, well, he didn't take the knight on f7 because he either saw the variations himself or at least believed that I had an attack, and so he played knight e4. Here we got a bunch of exchanges. Now, again, the opponent cannot take the knight on f7. If king takes f7, we take on e6 with check, and after king f8, we run through the same idea where we go bishop takes e7 check. The king has no squares to move, so the rook has to take. We take back with check, and after king g8, we can play something like rook g3. And again, the black king is just way too exposed. All of white's pieces are very active, so this is completely crushing. So, of course, our opponent saw all of that, did not take the knight, and simply played bishop f6. Here, I dropped the knight back to e5. This was actually not the best move because it allows knight takes e5, where we have to take back with a d-pawn. We cannot take with the f-pawn because that would leave our bishop undefended. And after bishop takes g5 and f takes g5, we're still up 2 pawns, but with all these minor pieces gone, this pawn here isn't great because we had this battery that's now not really doing anything. This position isn't as comfortable, unfortunately. So the engine actually wanted me to play f5. So after f5, you'll see that the pawn can't take because now there's this queen d5 idea where we have some discovery checks. And this gets very, very sharp. I didn't see this idea in the game. So I played knight e5. I didn't see the f5 idea, but knight e5 definitely gets the job done. My opponent played knight f8. Wasn't totally sure what the idea was behind that, but I took this opportunity to trade off some pieces and just get closer to an endgame where we're up 2 pawns and we have a very, very solid pawn structure. So here I played rook g3 check, checking the king, and the king has to go to h8. Now the king is all the way in the corner. And additionally, if this queen loses sight of the f7 square, we can play knight f7, which will be checkmate. So we're creating a threat as well. Here I went knight g4, so we're actually attacking this f6 pawn, and you might see that we're walking into a fork on f5, but this actually won't be an issue for us because in that position we'll have queen e5 check, which forces a queen trade, and then we'll take back with the knight, as you can see in the game. So f5, we check with the queen, and the queens are now traded. So my opponent goes rook e7. He has to play rook e7 because, again, we have this threat on f7. If he doesn't, we're going to play knight e7, and that'll be checkmate. So here we played king f2, and after rook c8, we finally brought our other rook back to the e file. And the idea here is just that we want to build up as much pressure on this e6 backwards pawn as possible. So we'll play something like knight f3 and knight g5. Hopefully we'll be able to play d5. We just want to build up the most pressure we can on this pawn. So my opponent plays rook c to c7, and here I go king e2. It's somewhat of a strange move, but essentially the principle that I was executing in this endgame is the principle do not rush. If you have the advantage in the endgame and your opponent has no counterplay, then you are in no rush to go for any kind of kill shot. Instead, what you can do is just simply improve the placement of all of your pieces until everything is optimally placed, then go for the kill. So that's what I was doing here, just bringing my king closer to the center. So black plays h5, and here I go king d3, finally centralizing my king. My opponent plays rook b7, threatening to play something like b5 and try to get some counterplay. So again, I just said do not rush. Let's just play c4 and let's just lock down this b5 square. And after the rook comes back to c7, again, do not rush. Let's just play b3. Keep it simple. This pawn structure on our queen side is very solid. And additionally, one of these pawns should be able to push forward and become a pass pawn. So our opponent goes king h7. We drop our knight back to f3, threatening knight g5, which of course would be a check, but we're also more concerned about just building pressure on this e6 pawn, this backwards pawn. So our opponent goes king g7. We finally bring our knight up to g5. And after king f6, we play h4, locking up the kingside pawn structure and just stopping any kinds of counterplay that our opponent might get. After rook c to d7, we also just play g3. Again, do not rush. We're just totally solidifying everything. Then my opponent plays rook d6, and now finally is the moment to strike. Now all of our pieces are very well placed, and we're ready to play d5. Now our opponent cannot take here, because of course then this rook would be hanging on e7. And additionally, our opponent cannot play e5, because then we'll take back with the pawn, and we'll be forking the rook and the king. So instead, our opponent plays knight d7. And here we're up 2 pawns, so I'm perfectly happy just trading everything off. We trade off all the rooks, and we have a fantastic pawn structure. Our opponent has no pawn breaks, and we're up 3 pawns at this point. So we're doing very well. We don't need to worry about anything. Let's just trade off all the pieces. So my opponent goes king e7. Here I went king c3. King d4 would have been better, just getting my king even more actively placed. I think I was worried about his knight just jumping around and starting to, attack all my pawns. So I went for king c3 just to be a little slower and push this b4 pawn up and, just create some pass pawns. But king d4 would have been better. So my opponent goes knight f6. I drop my knight back to g5 to protect this e4 square. And after king d6, I finally play b4, just trying to trade off some pawns here so that these central pawns will be able to push forward. My opponent goes knight d7. We trade pawns, and now I go king d4. So now my king is perfectly centralized. And after knight f6, we play c5 check, kicking the king back. We go king e5, attacking both the knight and the pawn, and black, of course, cannot save both. So he plays knight g4 check. I take on f5, and after knight e3 check, we go king e4, attacking the knight. After the knight moves, we play c6 check. Again, these pawns are pushing forward, and we just want to promote as quickly as we can. So in this position, our pawns here, the passed pawns, are well protected. The c6 pawn is, of course, protected by a pawn, and the d5 pawn is protected by the king. So it's going to be very difficult for black to win either of these. So in this position, I decided just to create a new threat by pushing this f pawn up and creating a new passed pawn that's very, very close to promotion. So here I played f5, and my opponent plays knight b6. He needs to try to bring his knight back to defend these pawns. So I just play f6. My opponent goes king d6, trying to get his king back. And after f7, my opponent is forced to play king e7 to try to stop this pawn from promoting. So here now I go c7, just pushing another pawn one step closer to promotion. So after c7, my opponent played knight c8. Here I went king e5, just moving my king forward one step closer. And after my opponent went king f8, I immediately saw king f6, which traps my opponent's king. The white king covers these 3 squares. The pawn covers these 2 squares, so the king can't move, which means that after knight h7 or knight e6 on the next move, the black king will be checkmated. So in this position, my opponent resigned. So all in all, I was really happy with how I played this game. I was particularly ecstatic when I saw knight takes f7. I probably sat at the board for a good 20 to 30 minutes just calculating that move to make sure that the variations actually worked out. So I was very proud of myself to see that. And hopefully I'll be able to have more nice attacking games just like that in the future. So if you liked this video and you found the analysis helpful, then please give it a thumbs up. Also feel free to subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this. I'm thinking every Thursday I'm going to post another classical game analysis. So if you liked this video, there will be many, many more of these.